JavaScript promises can be quite complex if you're a beginner, but even if you know how JavaScript promises work, you still might not be using them effectively. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 custom promise methods that are super useful and allow you to fully utilize the power of promises in JavaScript. I promise you, once you know these 3 custom promise methods, it will be very difficult for you to not keep on using them in every single project. So let's just dive straight in. Imagine this real world scenario where you are building an API, and normally it looks like this. So you might have a code that basically checks if the user exists. Then you might have a code that deducts credits from the user, and then you might have another code that will modify some data, which will be the purpose of the API. Now, this is how a beginner would write the code. So what they will do is you will have the user exist and will await the asynchronous function, and then you will have deduct credits and will await that as well. And then you'll have the modify data function. Now, if I run this code, let me run this code by running node, and then I'll go, let's find the code 01, and I think this one is called promise. Now, if I run the code, have a look at this. So basically, this is slowed down so we can see what is going on. Okay, so as you can see, if I run this again, we have it's giving us the user exists notification. So it's checking if the user exists, it's checking or it is deducting credits from the user, and then finally it is modifying the data, right? And the entire process takes around 6 seconds, which would be faster in a real world scenario. Now, this is the mistake that a beginner makes. So let us have a look at how the pro would code this code. Okay, so if I open the pro code, as you can see in this code, instead of running all the functions one by one, what we're doing is we're actually using a function called promise.allSettle. And this is something that is built into JavaScript. What promise.settle does is it takes an array. As you can see, you have an array over here. And what you do is you pass in functions in the array that return a promise. And what promise.allSettle will do is basically it will run all those functions at the same time. So in this case, or in the previous example where we had, if we ran the code, we had user exist that possibly takes like 1 second, and then we have deduct credits that maybe takes another second, and then we have the modified data, which did take some time. We can actually run all of them at the same time, and we can achieve a faster running code. So I'll just clear the screen, or let me run the code one more time and we'll just compare. Okay, so this is promise, the previous code. There we go. And now we'll run the pro code. So if to run the pro code, I'm going to go 01/pro code. Okay, and as you can see, it runs all the promises at the same time, and we achieve an efficiency where we go from 6 seconds all the way down to 2 seconds only. So that is something that is really, really useful in a real world scenario. So imagine that we have another function handling an API request, right? And I'll just walk you through what this function does. So what we have is we have a check just to check if the user exists. And then we have, or we need to implement some kind of a timeout. So as you can see, we have a section here that is waiting for a couple of seconds, and the seconds is basically passed in the function. Now, how do you implement something like this? Because after you wait, you apparently have to run more code after it, right? So what we do here is we just use the regular way, or this is how a beginner would do it. You will have a set timeout, and the set timeout is basically waiting for time in seconds times 1000, because set timeout accepts the parameter in milliseconds, right? So we'll have to convert seconds to milliseconds. And then inside the set timeout, we'll have a message for the user, and basically we'll remind the user after a couple of seconds, and then we'll save the info for the database, right? So this function, I'm calling it remind after. So it's very simple, or very similar to the user requesting that the user is reminded something after a couple of seconds. Now, as you can imagine, if we have to include sections in a code where we have to wait for a longer period of time or multiple periods, then we'll have to include multiple set times. So let's say we have to wait for like another 3 seconds after reminding the user before we save it into the database. So we'll just have to create another set timeout over here, and then we'll have what is effectively called a callback hell, because what you'll have is a function that calls a function that calls another function. First of all, let's run this code once just so that we know how it works. So I'll just go 02 promise await, and we'll run the code. So what it does is it says the user exists, and then we're waiting for 3 seconds, and then there's the message for the user, and then we just have the saved info to the database, right? Now, what we'll also do is we'll have a look at how the pro would run or create this same function. So if I go to the pro code, and everything is same except we have this particular function that is called the promise await. So let us look at what the function does. So what the function does is basically it takes a parameter of seconds, which will be in the type number, and it will return a promise. Now the promise basically accepts a function, and the first parameter of the function is always the resolve, right? So what we're doing effectively is that we are returning a promise, and then we have the first parameter as resolve, and then we're running a timeout. So in the previous example, we had the timeout, and then we had all the code inside the timeout. So in this case, what we're doing instead is we have the timeout and we're resolving the promise only when the timeout is complete, right? And now if you look at the modification or the changes that happen in the code, as you can see, we have the same checks, the user exists, and then we move on to the next section where we have to wait for a couple of seconds. And in this section, as you can see, we have, instead of a set timeout, like in the previous example, what we effectively have is promise await, and then we just tell it how many seconds the promise has to be delayed or how many seconds after which the promise has to be resolved, right? And so we can just put await, promise await, and then we can execute by passing the time in seconds, and then the rest of the code remains the same. And just so we know this is exactly the same code, I can run this again, but this time I'll just run the row code, and as you can see, it runs or gets the user, and then it waits for 3 seconds, and then the rest remains the same. The modifications or the benefits of writing the code in this way is that the code is much simpler to read, and not only that, you can also have multiple promise awaits anywhere in the function depending on how many times you want it. So if I want to wait again here, I'll just copy and paste this here. And then if I want to, let's say, do something else over here and then wait again, I can do that as well. And we completely avoid callback hell by using this approach. This is for those scenarios where you might have a very long running function and the function might sometimes get stuck. So this is usually the case when you have a very complex function. Maybe you have a database connection that is scraping some website using Puppeteer, or maybe something else that might get stuck. But regardless of the fact, this would be usable in a situation when you have a server function that you want to keep running for a very long time and you cannot afford the function to get stuck. So look at the scenario where we have a long running function, right? If I run the code, basically I'll do 0, 3 and I'm going to call it promise. So if I just run the function, what happens is it completes the action. So this is simulating scenarios where the function actually works fine and there is no network delays or no disconnections and everything is fine. But sometimes what might happen is this function might actually get stuck. So this is what a stuck function would look like. So in this scenario, I have given the example where I'm running this function and this function basically returns the promise in a very, very long time. And this is to simulate your server getting stuck. Now, in scenarios like this, well, this is how the beginner would write the code, right? Because if you look at the code, there is no redundancy or there is no way to handle a situation where the function might get stuck. So let us look at how a pro would code this in order to avoid the situation. Okay, so this is how a pro would code this. Now, as you can see, we also have a couple of boilerplate codes that you might want to stuff into your utils folder. So these are basically utilities that you might want to use in other functions as well, or multiple times in the same project. So the first one that you might want to see is this is basically a modified version of promise await. So promise await, the one function that we used in the earlier example, is, well, basically it's a function that returns a promise in a couple of seconds, or depending on what parameter you pass or the number of seconds you pass into the function. Now, this function has been modified in a way because instead of resolving the promise, it's basically rejecting the promise, right? So if you look at this line over here, it was something like resolve true, and we just changed it to reject function timeout. We also added another parameter up there. So what it does is it basically rejects the promise after a couple of seconds. And then this is what we're looking at. So this is called promise timeout, or at least that is what I decide to call this function. So what promise.timeout does is we are using a function called promise.raise. And again, just like we looked at promise.allSettle, this is a variation of promise.allSettle. So in promise.allSettle, what we had is we passed an array, right? And what promise.allSettle does is it basically waits till all the promises are satisfied, or it waits till all the promises are resolved. Now, promise.raise is different in the sense that promise.raise will only return the promise that gets executed first. So in this example, we're passing, basically we have a default timeout of around 5 seconds and we're racing between two promises. The first promise we're racing is obviously promise.await or promise await reject, which is the function that I described above. And the next thing we're racing against is the callback function. Now, let us look at how we can implement this, right? So this is, again, the same function that sometimes gets stuck, and this is the code. So you have the other code up there, and then you have this section. So in a scenario where everything is working fine, what it might look like, it might look something like this. and action complete. So, right? So this is again simulating a long running function that works well, and we have a timeout of around 5 seconds. Now, what happens if we pass in a function that definitely will get stuck? So this is again simulating the function actually getting stuck in the real world, right? So we run the code again, and we just wait for 5 seconds. Now, what will happen here is that promise.race will basically raise the promise await reject function, which will return a promise or basically reject a promise in 5 seconds. And we're also racing against the callback. So what you see the output here is that you have a error called function timeout, right? And the reason you had this error is because, as you can see, the will get stuck function actually got stuck, and promise timeout came into the rescue, and it rescued us from this stall. So now you might have other redundancies where you can just rerun this function if it doesn't work, or you might just log an error. So this is again a real world scenario where promise timeout could be very, very useful for you.
That's it from me for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. Consider subscribing for more content just like this one. Bye.